Let me share one idea and and sort of hype up the dialogic quality of this a second. And one of the things I'm very interested in right now is the multiple voices that we carry, and the fact that many of those voices are contrary to each other, and that always is a possibility for a voice, whatever you're doing, for a voice of doubt, of contradiction, so that whatever you stand for, there's also another voice in there that probably doesn't stand for that or stands for its opposite. And I have the same feeling about my own work. There's always something there which is saying, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. And they're often voices of people that I carry. And one of those had to do with appreciative inquiry, a trajectory I've seen, and I just want to raise that and see what you do with it. As part of the early for transformation book was an argument against trying to solidify human behavior in terms of laws or rules. And you bring up the possibility, once you establish that, there's always the possibility for contradiction. Another way of saying that is that you can never repeat the same sentence twice, because the second time already borrows from the meaning it had or effect it had the first time. It already takes into account what's already been said, and therefore doesn't become the same thing. So I love you at time 1 is not the same as time 10 as time 50. And at some point it reaches banality. So the question becomes then, as I've watched appreciative inquiry, and to some extent the summit ideas become a technology which becomes codified and which everybody uses and becomes a certain kind of rhythm or standard which everybody learns. To what extent isn't that going to have that same freezing quality and move toward banality? What's going to prevent it from doing that, where people say, oh, here's another AI again? And with anything that's repeated, the possibility emerges of manipulation with it. Well, look, they're unhappy, let's run an AI and they'll all be happy again. So it becomes now a manipulative device to keep people in line. So it's that freezing of those incredible ideas and the practical implications that I worry about and wonder if you do too.
I do a little bit, but you know, part of what is happening is that I'd say, even though we started writing about these things about what 25, 28 years ago, Diana, the learning curve just the last 2 or 3 years, and part of it is being in dialogue with the world, you know, not being caught in an ivory tower and so on. And every one of these things, you know, appreciative inquiries that we do, we're just all, you know, and recently, it's like you're stepping beyond your competence every single time. And so being in that kind of modality and being very, very in relationship to whatever that context and situation is absolutely, you know, critically important. You know, a couple years ago, Kofi Annan called and said, we want to bring, it was at a time where they're pounding on all the corporations in the world, WorldComs and everything was happening. And he said to the CEOs, you know, we need to have a different kind of dialogue. And so he brought together 500 CEOs, Lord Brown from BP, Daniel Vasella, the head of Novartis, to have a dialogue with the NGOs and with the government agencies and so on. And they decided to break the mold, you know, from this monological pattern. You know, Bakhtin talks about how we need to break this monological hold, and went into these dialogic processes. It was so exciting, but you are always on the edge. You know, you never know what's going to happen. It's always different, and I think that's partly for me the lesson that you know, in terms of bridging theory and practice. That's where it stays alive, when you're on the edge.
Yeah. And yet it's taught as if it's like just a technique. Often. And that's the way often I see it carried out. Now, do you see that expanding now? Do you see it beginning to create new flowers of practice that are not exactly the 4Ds? I mean, is that taking place for you?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a couple things coming together that are quite powerful, and one is these sustainable value networks, and this whole idea of of combining these massively and auto-generating networks with the Appreciative Inquiry Summit methodology. It's been really a privilege to work on some of these kinds of things. Let me ask you a question about an organization. Which organization in the world will save more lives next year from children and women picking toxic chemically treated or cotton in the world? It's Walmart, and they are working on the sustainability agendas in a tremendously serious and exciting way, and we're working with them to kind of create a sustainable company at all different levels. But the way we're doing it is creating these networks that blur the boundaries between the organization and the outside world. So they have networks where 90% of the membership of these networks are NGOs and World Wildlife Funds and local communities and so on. And they have these 12 sustainable design networks happening in electronics and fisheries and every domain imaginable. And they couple that with Appreciative Inquiry Summits that creates like a heartbeat between the face-to-face and the virtual possibilities. And it's very exciting to see the new developments happening there.
Yeah, I love that. As an academic, I also begin to think about, well, what would be a way of expanding the arena of possibilities of practice? And one of those is to locate sort of micro parts of, let's say, AI, which play an important function, and try to think about what is the function they play and why they're so important.
Right.
And if you could identify them, then you can transfer them.
Right.
I'll just give you one example.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take AI, one of the things that really has struck me is the power of the stories, in the same sense that you've been telling right now. There's something that's transfixing about the story, about narrative. Now, what is it about narrative that does that? There's a way in which, because of long traditions, narratives invite us to kind of suspend belief. They invite us to go into a space of reality, of sharing that space, of listening to the storyteller, unwind, and imagining oneself in that space. They become imaginary spaces in which we live for the time that person is telling the story. And if the person is the protagonist, like it's happened to me, and I went there and I saw it and I witnessed, and as you've just been doing, you become that witness. We are you. You're carrying us through and describing this land. And everything else falls away. And we then come to take on who you are. And when we listen to the stories of people in organizations, what gave life to me in this instance, how we succeeded in doing that, and was very important to me. We become that other person and begin to carry that person, and the zeal in this case begins to carry over, because now I carry you and I carry that orientation. So storytelling then becomes one of those features. Public Conversations uses it, other people use it, but you can begin. Madeline Blair uses it all the time.
You talk about kind of a polyvocal notion where we recognize the other voices inside of us, and this narrative process helps open those other voices inside of us. And I never talked to you about this one, but you wrote a little bit about an experiment with von Glazerfield, where
von Glazerfield.
Is that an example of this?
Yeah, it was wonderful. I've been brought into a number of debates. And I usually show up for these debates. And
this one sounded dramatic to me.
But it was, I think Jerry Gale was there, John Schotter was there. It was an attempt to look at constructivism, which had been popular at the time and now sort of morphed into constructionism, as opposed to social construction. They were like two different epistemologies. One was strongly individualist. I construct in my head, sort of Piagetian style, and social construction, which is really all about the relational creation meaning. But it was a large conference in education, and what they did was to set it up so that it was going to be a head-on clash. So Von Glassersfeld and I were supposed to present our positions, and then someone else was to attack each other. John attacked Von Glassersfeld. Well, then it was like an open meeting like this, and then they opened it for discussion, and within about 3 or 4 minutes, the whole place is shouting. It's like people are angry. Listening, like fists, and someone stood on a chair. It was like, and then you looked and said, God, I gotta spend 3 more days with these people. And nobody wanted to be there. And so Carl Tom, who was a therapist and also into a lot of these ideas, we stopped the conference. And what he did was to interview me as Ernst von Glassersfeld,
right,
and vice versa. And I'd known Ernst for a long time. And I could talk as he does, and I know a lot of his theories, and we had relationships, so I could talk about me as Ernst, and vice versa. And it cooled the whole thing down, because you could realize that, yeah, we could do argument, but that's just one practice, and we had the possibilities for a lot of other practices that weren't that, and you couldn't fight it to the finish because you were the other person already.
See, and I think that's an example of dialogues that deliver in that sense. And you know, and what you were asking about in appreciative inquiry in that microsocial moment, how does that occur? I have a story that's very similar to this one, and I think it's this notion of polyvocality where we find the other voices inside of us. But this was really exciting work. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said if only the world's religious leaders could talk to one another, the world would be a better place. He was in Jerusalem. He was with a venture capitalist, Richard Blum, and he said, if only the world's religious leaders would talk. You know, we don't talk. I've been on the same platform with the Pope, but we don't speak. We don't know what's in each other's hearts, and so on. And so Richard Blum, the venture capitalist, said, what would you like to do? He said, I'd like to create a series of dialogues, the very highest levels of these religious groups. And the higher you go in these religions, the less dialogue there is. And we received a call to help design the questions and to facilitate those dialogues. And it was tremendously exciting, very tense, you know. Dalai Lama also noticed, or Harvard had just done a study, that over half the armed conflicts in the world weren't between people of different nation states, but between different religious identities. And so, you know, in the appreciative inquiry process, you work, you know, a lot on the questions, and what are the questions we're going to ask that will help move these dialogues to a deeper level, and so on. And it was tremendously exciting. But I remember the night we arrived, the tensions in this meeting were huge. And, you know, people arrived, there was some food set up, there was no formal meeting that night, but people arrived, and I remember a Greek Orthodox bishop sitting next to perhaps another Christian, and he said, I don't know about these dialogues, I don't know about this meeting, what would St. Paul say about a meeting like this? And you know, so there were those kinds of tensions, and the next morning, you know, Dalai Lama talked for about 20 minutes, and then turn it over to start the appreciative inquiry. And very often what we'll do is have people turn to the person next to them, and very deliberately diverse groups, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, all different, and it was exciting, you know, and the dialogue, the conversations went on and on. We had 5 powerful questions, and but then using this polyvocal idea, instead of having people introduce themselves, we had them introduce their partner, their friend, or their colleague that they had just interviewed. And so this Greek Orthodox bishop gets up, and he puts his hand on the person he had interviewed, and he was still nervous. And I thought, why is this guy still nervous? He said, and he had interviewed and had the conversation with His Holiness Swami Chinananda, beautiful man, 84 years old, flowing beard, and so on. So the Greek Orthodox bishop, and he stands up and he looks nervous. I said, how could this be after all of this attention and time and dialogue? And he says, well, I want to introduce His Holiness Swami Chinananda, and I just want to say, the heck with it, I love this man. This man has a good heart. This man has a good heart. And later, you know, I wrote about that and the whole idea of a paper called The Surprise of Friendship. And what these groups were looking for, they didn't need to sign charters to save the world's environment and this and that, but what they needed was a way to have center-to-center contact and connection, and then ultimately, in this case, to find the voices inside of themselves that were the voices of the other. So when they're introducing themselves, introducing the other, the whole trust and identity is in that person's hands across these domains. So anyway, that's just an example, I think, of how some of these concepts have helped to feed some of the experimentation.
Yeah, I love it.